Hello and welcome back to another episode of TGP. On hand, you've got Justin, author of the Torchlit Gaming Substack, and my co-host for the program. My name is John, retro gaming enthusiast here. This is episode number 3, and our topic of the day is the E word. That's right, emulation. We hit a brief pause on TGP over the holidays, but never fear, we are back in action. Justin, welcome back aboard. Hope the holidays treated you well.
Yeah, most definitely. Got to spend time with family and do all that fun stuff. Hope you got to do some fun stuff as well.
Yes, sir, I cannot complain. You also have some recent articles on the Torchlit Gaming Substack, including your picks for the best games of 2024, a retrospective on Final Fantasy VIII, and a write-up on your history with Magic the Gathering. Some good reads. We'd love for our listeners to go check those out as well. Let's start with the big picture here. What is emulation really? We're going to get more into the nuances during this episode, but to boil it down, emulation is basically one computer mimicking another. That sounds perfectly innocent, right? But when you start to talk about pirated video games, things turn dicey fast. The tricky part lies in the way that emulation is used, and you'll be surprised to know that isn't always just for playing illegally downloaded games.
Few things are more controversial in the gaming lexicon than the E word. And yes, I'm talking about emulation. Let's get right into some of the legal gray area that surrounds this topic. So, what exactly is emulation? To put it simply, emulation is when software or hardware allows one computer to act and behave just like another. Such a device is known as an emulator. Emulators, as you might expect, are highly valued by gamers for many reasons, such as their ability to play and preserve games from old, obsolete, and unsupported platforms. Many people may not realize that emulators are generally legal, unless they infringe on a console's copyright protections. However, as we will soon discover, the bar to meet this criteria has been set quite high. Much of what emulator development ostensibly aims to achieve is the deconstruction and reverse engineering of the software. The doctrine of fair use often extends legal protections to these activities. There have been court cases brought by Nintendo against emulators where the Big N has won. For example, in a recent highly publicized case, Tropic Haze, the owners of the Yuzu emulator, settled for $2.4 million after Nintendo brought DMCA actions against them. DMCA is the part of the Copyright Act that protects digital copyrights. Nintendo's lawyers argued that Tropic Haze developed and distributed Yuzu, bypassing encryption on the Nintendo Switch and allowing users to gain unauthorized access to copyrighted games. They even argued that via Yuzu, The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom specifically was decrypted and downloaded over 1 million times 10 days before its public release. A settlement was quickly reached in this case. In fact, less than 1 week after Tropic Haze received the suit, in a huge victory for the Big N. Tropic Haze had to pay the $2.4 million, destroy all their encryption-breaking tools, as well as cease and desist all emulator-related activities. For the game development companies, their arguments boil down to the financial harm they say the emulators and decryption tools are causing. There is also the ongoing case of Twitch, YouTube, and Kick streamer Jesse Keegan, aka Every Game Guru. Jesse is being sued by Nintendo for boastfully streaming numerous pirated games prior to their release, such as Zelda Echoes of Wisdom and Mario and Luigi Brothership. He faces a potential fine of $7 million if found guilty of all charges. On the flip side, there have also been cases where the emulator companies had success in the courts. After all, the emulator itself is usually not illegal, but rather the application of it, specifically in its potential to play pirated games and how those game files are acquired. For example, when the Sony PlayStation was at the height of its popularity in 1999, the first high-quality, full-speed emulator of the console was released, allowing the games to be played on PC, both on Mac and later Windows. The emulator was called the Virtual Game Station by Connectix. Not only did VGS support almost every PS1 game released at that time, but it was also discounted, costing less than 50% of the price of a PS1. About a year later, Sony took them to court. In a surprise unanimous verdict, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in favor of Connectix. They determined that copying a system BIOS during emulator development is not copyright infringement, but fair use. The court went even further, saying this did not tarnish Sony's trademark. The two companies later settled their differences out of court, with Sony ultimately purchasing the VGS rights from Connectix and discontinuing the emulator permanently. The case proved to be somewhat of a landmark ruling, which some say laid down the legal precedent for emulation in the United States. When it comes to downloading, sharing, and/or hosting game files, also known as ROMs, these practices are generally illegal, with some exceptions. For example, gamers may be protected if they recreate a game they legally own into a file playable within an emulator. There's certainly a lot to debate when it comes to the legality of emulation. The E word often gets lumped into the category of piracy for piracy's sake. But today, we're going to examine why that case is far from closed.
Now, Justin, emulation often gets the negative connotation of piracy for piracy's sake, but that's not always the case, is it?
Not always. There's also plenty of ways that emulation itself is utilized in a lot of surprising ways, honestly, going as far back to the 1960s. And here's a fun fact for you. The first emulator ever made was by IBM in 1963 on their IBM System 360 computers, and they were used to emulate earlier IBM machines. So that's not always just piracy, it's also used for computers and emulating different types of computer-based things.
Definitely. I wasn't aware of the fun fact, but I am aware that people emulate Windows computers on Linux and vice versa. So operating systems are definitely involved with that as
Mhm.
well.
Yes.
Now, I feel like I need to add the disclaimer to this episode that we aren't endorsing the notion that you go and log on to the dark web, illegally download games, then that you crack encryption keys, and that you stream games that aren't out yet on Twitch. Those things are all illegal for a good reason. We're simply exploring concepts like preservation and archival of games from older generations so that new generations still get a chance to experience them before they are ultimately lost to time. We're taking a look into the issue of historical research for modern game development, or you might just have a broken old Sega Genesis in your closet, which I actually do. And you may ask the question, do I still have a recourse for playing my copy of Sonic 2 legally? Games are part of the culture that produces them, and an increasing amount of games are disappearing completely to time from a lack of preservation. Today, we want to show you how the gaming industry itself responds to emulation in ways that might surprise you. So, yeah, that's my disclaimer, and please don't sue us. I want to mention a few alternative applications of emulation that go beyond simply pirating a game or copying it one to one. And I'd like to get your take on each one of these points. I'm going to talk about the legality at the end, but let's start with translation patches.
One of my all-time favorite uses. So back in the day, and actually it still occurs today, there were some notorious translation groups that would take Japanese Super Nintendo games and translate them into English. This happened in the late 90s, early 2000s. One of those translation groups was DJAP, and they've actually translated some of the more popular games that we didn't get over here, like Star Ocean, Bahamut Lagoon, which actually got multiple translations over the years. Far East of Eden Zero, which is relatively newer, Tales of Fantasia, and then there was another group called Eon Genesis that translated actually some of my favorite games by Square and Enix and those. They did Front Mission Gun Hazard, Gunman's Proof, Lagrange Point, which if you haven't played it, it's an amazing original Nintendo game. Live Alive, which we talked about previously. Metal Max Returns, Shin Megami Tensei 1, 2, and If. Tactics Ogre, Let Us Clean Together. I think they came out before PlayStation Portable, but I don't think it came out before the PlayStation 1 release. I could be wrong on that. And Treasures of the Rudras. Like a lot of those games, I would have never been able to play if it wasn't for DJAP and Eon Genesis doing all this for free to let us play games that were never going to make it here. And of course, because of those groups, you could even say today that that generated enough interest to show Square Enix translating Trials of Mana, Live Alive, the remake, all that stuff was worthwhile because we've played it before thanks to these groups. So it's kind of one of those sort of things.
I'm glad you mentioned Trials of Mana because one game that admittedly I emulated as a teenager, Seiken Densetsu 3, and I believe it was either DJAP or Eon Genesis. I don't remember which one. It's a game that we would have had no other means of playing until past couple years when it was released as Trials of Mana. It was remastered and a full remake was made as well.
Yes.
That's a game from my childhood that I would never have had a chance to experience unless I found that translation patch. Let's look at ROM hacks as another method of emulation that's not just a one-to-one copy of a game.
So there's actually a lot of cool ROM hacks out there. I think the most famous one is probably Kaizo Mario, where it turns Super Mario World generally on its head and makes it way harder. I don't know if our listeners have heard of Grand Pooh Bear or any of those guys, or even on GameStone Quick. They do Kaizo Mario runs all the time, and those were all because of emulation and being able to hack the ROM. They were able to make these different Kaizo Mario games. There's so many out there. There's Grand Poo World, there's Barbarous, there's what's it Barbarous? I know Barbarous King does it, but I can't remember the exact name of his hack. There's so many, and it's always so interesting to watch how creative people can be with these ROM hacks. And speaking of creative ROM hacks, I think one of the most interesting ones I've seen in a long time is the Link to the Past Super Metroid randomizer, where they take Link to the Past and they take Super Metroid and smash them together and make it to where you can find items from either game in either game. So you might be in Norfair on Super Metroid and you might find the arrows from Legend of Zelda, so then it unlocks it in Zelda. And anytime you go into a room, you have a chance of switching to the other game. So you're constantly switching between these games to complete each of them. It's wild, and I highly recommend checking it out if you haven't.
Very cool. How about demakes, which, if our listeners aren't familiar, that would be the reverse of a remake. Instead of upgrading the game, it would be downgrading the game. For example, taking a 16-bit game and reimagining it on 8-bit hardware.
Yeah, there's a lot of those. I know of a few official ones, like for example, this is going to date me totally. But back in the 360 days, there was a game called Dark Void. It was an okay Konami game. It didn't make waves or anything. But in order to drum up hype for that game, they actually made an official demake. It was released on all the stores like Xbox 360 and the PlayStation Store, but it was a demake that basically turned it into an 8-bit game. That's actually the only version of the game I played. I've never played the actual game, so that's pretty funny. There's also a demake of Quest 64 for Game Boy Color, I believe, where it was the Quest game, but for Game Boy Color. There's also Daikatana on Game Boy Color, which actually a lot of people think is the better version of Daikatana, which is funny. I know Metal Gear Solid came out on Game Boy Color. I don't know if it was specifically a demake. I don't think it was, but it had a lot of the same stuff on the Game Boy Color.
Yep, I'm kind of a Metal Gear nerd. I think you're talking about Ghost Babel, and that was not really a demake, but it is a good game and it's definitely worth playing. It's got some missions and you have codec calls with your superior. It's a pretty neat game.
Yeah.
Also, I did have quite a bit of fun with Quest for Game Boy Color, Brian's Journey. It's an official demake, like you mentioned, and I like it that they try to demake the music from the original game, and they do a pretty decent job of remaining faithful to the source material. So I thought that one was pretty cool. Moving on, how about a version of ROM hacking where difficulty can be rebalanced? And I guess I should clarify that not all of these are actual hacks. Some of them are just version differences. What are your thoughts on difficulty rebalancing in games?
I think for me, I don't usually go for them because I try to play the game as they are, but there have been a few that have been pretty interesting. There's a project where, for those of you that don't know, when Final Fantasy IV was released in the US, they basically made it way easier. They took out a bunch of the abilities, they took out a bunch of items, they added items to make the game easier. They actually took that game and ported it to Japan as Final Fantasy IV Easy Type. Now, there's a project that basically keeps, if I'm not mistaken, it keeps Final Fantasy II as it is, but it adds back all the stuff that they left out. So all the items are returned, all the summons that they took out, all the abilities. So it's kind of a difficulty patch because they're trying to restore it to the original Japanese difficulty. And I played it a couple times, and it's pretty fun. It's a little difficult, not any more difficult than like the Pixel remasters or anything, but it's pretty cool that people have been able to basically quote unquote restore a game's difficulty that way. I think you said that there was a Bayou Billy one, right?
There is, and it is not a ROM hack. It's just a version difference. It's a practical difference. Bayou Billy originated on PC, and it was under the name of Mad City. The Japanese version that was released on Famicom is much more user friendly. It's not punishingly difficult. So basically, the US version artificially enhanced the difficulty, and we did talk about that in episode 2
Hmm.
about game mechanics. And I'll give you a couple others that to me are very practical times where it's good to have a counterpart to the US version. One of them is an RPG I'm sure you've played for Super Nintendo, Seventh Saga. It's
Oh,
notorious
yes.
for being extremely difficult. And fun fact, I actually did beat that game and grind the whole game. It was very enjoyable. But the Japanese version of the game is called Elnard, and by all accounts, the US programmers made some mistakes and miscalculations when they did the leveling math in the game. They also made some other mistakes when it comes to attacking and defending. The use of defending in that role playing game is probably the weirdest, most broken use of defending in any game, but that's beside the point. But the Japanese version of Seventh Saga, Elnard, is a good way to experience a game that's just broken in its difficulty. Although, once again, I did beat the US version of the game. It's a huge grind, tons of hours that I put into that, but honestly, a good experience. And then one more I can give you is a pretty obscure game that we also talked about, I think, in our first episode, Dino City. The
Hmm.
US difficulty was cranked up to an 11 for whatever reason. It's still a beatable game. It's just a very difficult platformer that's very frustrating, and there's some cheap deaths and whatnot. But the Japanese version gives you a lot more leniency. So just a practical application of difficulty rebalance in a different version. You mentioned randomizers. You mentioned the one that crosses Link to the Past with Super Metroid. Some people dive into these games and create hacks to randomize games. Any other experiences that you have with those?
Oh, definitely. I think I'll mention a few of my absolute favorite, and in fact, I might write an article about this because I'm going to geek out a little bit. Some of my favorite randomizers ever are Free Enterprise, which takes Final Fantasy IV, which I mentioned earlier. It takes that game and basically makes it an open world game where you can take the ship called the Enterprise, the airship, and fly anywhere. And how it does it is it takes all the event flags in the game and it allows you to trigger those events as you see fit. So, with a few exceptions, for the most part, what you're trying to do is you're trying to collect all the key items so that you can make your way to the moon and beat the final boss. There's ways that you can pay your way to get to the moon. If you set the randomizer a certain way, you can make it to where you just randomly find key items. There's all sorts of stuff. And that you can actually go to the Free Enterprise website and check all the flags exactly how you want them to be. You put in your ROM and it'll spit out the randomizer after it applies all its patches and everything. It's very cool. It's one of my favorite randomizers of all time. The other one is for Final Fantasy V. It's called Job Fiesta, and I don't have a lot of experience with it. I've played it a few times. It's kind of similar in a way to free enterprise, where it lets you mix up how the game works and everything like that. It was pretty cool from what I played, but I don't have as much experience with that as I do free enterprise. The other game I do have a lot of experience with is Emerald Rogue, which takes Pokemon Emerald and changes it into a roguelike, and that game is incredible too. If you're tired of playing Pokemon the same way, highly, highly, highly recommend Emerald Rogue. It basically turns the game on its head. You have a hub world. You choose your starter Pokemon and you go down these certain paths and you can choose what type of path you want to take, whether it's like a water path, a grass path. Then you can also run into towns to get items and things like that. It's also incredible and I highly, highly recommend it.
Another way that people change the code in games or change the game itself is with quality of life improvements. I can think of one in Legend of Zelda, just a very base example of a quality of life upgrade. Link to the Past, instead of menuing to change items every time that you need to switch from a boomerang to a bomb or arrow, so on, you can use the shoulder buttons. You can just use L and R to change your weapons or items. That's one example of a quality of life improvement. Anything that you are aware of that is worth mentioning?
For the DS, there's a couple where so the Legend of Zelda games, again, these games are often quality of life improved, apparently. They're for Spirit Tracks and Phantom Hourglass, how you used to play it on the DS was with the stylus to move and do all your actions. There's a couple of quality of life improvements where they took those actions and mapped them to the D-pad and the face buttons so that you can play it like a typical Zelda. There's still some actions that require the touchscreen, but it drastically changes how the game is played overall. It makes it a lot more enjoyable. There's also for Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow, where you have to use the touch screen to scribble out the different sigils to beat bosses. There's a patch that lets you just bypass those altogether. So it's useful if you're playing on a computer and you don't have access to a touch screen or you don't want to use a mouse, then you can just use that ROM and it'll do all that stuff for you so you don't have to worry about it. Same thing with the touch stuff where you normally touch the ice to break it, it'll let you just bypass that altogether. And then the last quality of life patch I know of, it's actually for the 3DS where you can get Super Mario 64 DS and same thing you could move with the stylus, but instead they use the face buttons and you can do like widescreen hacks and stuff. So it's pretty interesting all the different quality of life stuff that's out there.
I'm also aware of some hacks that allow you to play SNES games using CD quality audio, although it would take up more space, of course. Definitely a lot of room for creativity when it comes to quality of life hacks.
Speaking of the SNES CD hacks, that's an interesting topic to touch on, and we might want to explore this further in the future. But the reason those came about is because they found that SNES PlayStation. I don't know if you remember that back in the day, how it became a big ordeal. And they kind of used that to envision how they thought the SNES CD add on would work. And so if you ever want to kind of get a glimpse of that, you just look up MSU 1, and that's what they think would make an SNES CD game play like. I think there's one for Chrono Trigger, there's one for Legend of Zelda, Link to the Past. There's all sorts of games that's been enhanced by this at this point. And like you said, you download all the music and the emulator itself reads the music and it's basically playing a PlayStation SNES game, really. It's pretty neat. And that's a good thing to bring up as far as that goes.
Yeah, it reminds me of Sega CD, where you would have like Echo the Dolphin on Sega Genesis, and then they would release Echo the Dolphin on Sega CD. But the main difference was just that it had CD quality audio, which was pretty cool. Now, was it worth spending the money that require for you to get that hardware and get the game and everything? That's debatable, but it was a pretty cool experience to have CD quality audio, especially in those days.
Hmm.
One other reason that people turn to emulation is to unlock what would otherwise be a region locked game, like a PAL version only, if we live in the US and we don't have another method of playing it. Any PAL games that you can think of off the top of your head that would have been worth emulating?
I think you know the answer to this one. It's the most obvious one, especially for us old folk that grew up with Super Nintendo, and that's going to be Terra Enigma for sure. Being part of the whole Illusion of Gaia, Soul Blazer unofficial trilogy.
To my knowledge, there is no other way of playing that game because if you don't have a console that is capable of playing PAL games, I believe there's a modification that has to be made to the cartridge slot to play the PAL
Mhm.
game. But if you don't have that, then you really have little means available to play it.
Yeah, it's never been released, re-released as far as I know. I think it's only ever come out on Super Nintendo.
And I would say highly deserving of, a modern re-release. So a lot of the examples that we just talked about are celebrations of games in new and creative ways. I just want to note, and I mentioned I was going to talk about the legality. I want to note that hacking a ROM for any of the reasons that we just discussed is arguably legal if and only if it's done for your personal use and your enjoyment. If you distributed it, then it would be illegal. And if you sold it, it would be even more so. I can also say that making a backup ROM of a game that you own is also legal, but downloading it from the internet is not unless the copyrights have expired and the game is in public domain. But just because a game is old, don't assume that would be the case. Also, let's say that you lose or you sell your original game. Well, you would then have to delete the ROM since you don't own a physical copy any longer. You have any thoughts about the legality of ROMs and emulation?
As far as that goes, it's the legality changes so often. Like because we're from America, so we go by the American laws of the legality between this. Other countries don't have the same tough piracy laws that we do. Which, granted, protecting one's IP is perfectly reasonable, especially if it's a game that's still made and all that jazz. I 100% understand. It's one of those things where, like you said, as long as you're making backups, there's actually certain hardware that lets you make backups of games. I think it's Game Boy Operator. It even lets you tell fake from real carts and things like that. So it's pretty neat. It's definitely a slippery slope. Totally depends on so many factors. There's even arguments that making backups of games you own isn't technically legal. It's kind of all over the place. It's not exactly clear. I saw an article recently where Nintendo lawyers themselves were saying, well, emulation itself isn't illegal. So it depends on what you do with the technology, really. So, like I said, it's a slippery slope and it's hard to say one way or the other. There's definitely arguments made for both sides, especially when you get into preservation. There's a whole group of people that have been trying to preserve games for years now, and it gets harder because a lot of these companies don't save their source code and they don't save any of their data regarding games. It's like once it's made and it's put on a card or a CD or whatever, and it's out the door, then nobody cares. But the thing is, as time goes on, I think companies are starting to see, oh crap, we should probably save these things because then we can re-release it on the newest hardware and it's not as difficult. Because there's been plenty of times when they've lost source code, they've lost assets, and they want to re-release it. Kingdom Hearts a good example. I think the first one they lost the source code, maybe even the second one. Final Fantasy VIII might have had its source code lost. A lot of the ports that we get today are PC ports that have been pushed through for whatever console they're trying to push it on. But I know Kingdom Hearts had to be rebuilt from the ground up because they lost all the source code. But what's also interesting is even though these companies say they don't keep track of it, there was also the notorious Nintendo Giga leak recently where all that stuff came to light that they kept. And some of it was lost. They didn't have all of it. We could still find some Pokemon data and all that kind of stuff. So, this whole conversation is very interesting, especially when you try to balance what's harmful and what's fine. That's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of gray area. And you rightfully pointed out, you made a very good point that We're just talking about the way it is in our country, but other countries you will find more relaxed when it comes to copyright laws. In the United States, it's generally the rule of thumb is downloading ROMs from the internet would be illegal, but generally making a backup if you own the game is legal, although Nintendo may say differently. But let's pivot to one of Nintendo's biggest arguments against downloading their old games, the Virtual Console. Virtual Console started back in 2006, and it had over 10 million downloads in its first 2 years, capitalizing on the popularity of retro gaming. You might call it Nintendo's first salvo in the war on emulation. Remember, this is a company that is historically very heavy-handed when it comes to their legal team cracking down on piracy. Justin, you have any particular nostalgia for a Virtual Console?
Yeah, so the Virtual Console, it's kind of a loaded question for me because on the one hand, I was there when the Wii launched, and I remember Virtual Console coming out, and I remember buying NES games, SNES games, and it was nice to be able to buy those retro games from Nintendo where I could just download it and play it and be done. But the thing is, there was a lot of people that were really sad when Virtual Console went away, and I get it. You want to be able to purchase your games and save them and be able to play them whenever you want. But the reality of the situation for me is how many people realistically have a Wii laying around? Some people do, like retro gamers, totally. And they shut down the Wii store long ago. And at that point, I think you can still download games you had, but it's one of those things where it's like when it comes to digital games, it's a license and you don't really own it. So once it shuts down, it's down. So it's like, yeah, I understand people wanting Virtual Console back so they can bring their games over, but Nintendo being Nintendo, we saw where when they went from Wii to Wii U and they had the Virtual Console come across, you still had to pay to transfer those games, and it was ridiculous. They've actually created Nintendo Switch Online games to kind of fill the gap, and I'm fine with that, honestly. I think with the Virtual Console, they kind of had a stranglehold on what retro games came to their systems, and there were some companies that would put out retro games here and there, like Capcom would put out 10 different Mega Man collections. Capcom might put out, I don't know, like a Breath of Fire collection every now and then. But that was kind of it. But once the Virtual Console went away, they kind of opened the floodgates for the companies to fill the gap, so to speak, because we've seen so many retro collections, way cheaper than anything Nintendo put out. There's been so many Capcom fighting collections that have been released recently between 1 and 2, the Marvel collection, they did the Beat 'em Up collection, and they were all like $30, $40. And it's like I prefer that where I could buy the retro games from the companies themselves in massive collections where I can get like 6 games that I would get for maybe the price of 2 or 3 games on Virtual Console. And then I have a physical cartridge of it. That's what I prefer personally. And NSO is great. I'm fine with it. I have a family plan. I up it every year because if I feel the need to play Mario Party 2 with my family, I could just launch the N64 one and play it, and that's that. And Switch 2 is coming out. Switch 2 is probably going to have it in this, so I think they announced that it will. And we'll be able to play all those games on Switch 2 as well, so that's great, and it just transfers right over. I think now's the best time for retro gaming as far as that goes, versus I think people have rose-tinted glasses when it comes to Virtual Console. Yes, it was great, but at the end of the day, I think it's even better now because companies are starting to realize, oh, people actually give a shit about our old games. We should probably keep releasing those. Like Square Enix has done a fantastic job. Like not even have they come out with collections, they've been remastering and remaking their old games. Like Live Alive, we talked about that. Trials of Man, we talked about that. The Front Mission games are getting remasters. Like it's a great time to be a retro gamer at this point.
Yeah, one thing I like about Virtual Console, maybe this is just me, was having it available on DS and 3DS. Something about just playing some of my favorite classic Super Nintendo games and having them official on my handheld, like Super Metroid and Earthbound. Something about that I just enjoy.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I mean, like I said, I'm not saying Virtual Console is a terrible idea, and I don't think it was bad or anything, but I think it was very restrictive at the time And I feel like now with NSO, like even with NSO as it is, they're even putting out more Japanese games. I know we got some on Virtual Console, but we're getting the Satellaview games in America now and all sorts of crazy stuff. And I think it's kind of cool that they're trying to expand retro gaming versus holding it hostage, so to speak. Even if you go on the Nintendo eShop now for Switch, there's I think MSX games on there now. There's a whole Neo Geo. I think they probably released every single Neo Geo game ever made at this point. There's just all sorts of retro games, and some companies do it wrong and they make those games way too expensive. I acknowledge that 100%. But for every one of those, there's a Capcom, Square Enix, whatever collection or remaster or remake. Mario RPG got remade recently. I liked Virtual Console for the time, but I'm kind of glad how it is now, and more companies are involved in trying to put out retro games. I think there's even going to be a new River City Techno collection of like 8 games or something, and they're bringing all these games. And that's the other thing is now they see that it's profitable, so they're more willing to bring over games and translate them. Think about it. Before Switch, we didn't have Trials of Mana available on any platform in America. Not Wii, not Wii U, not 3DS, nothing until I guess the collection of mana sold well. I don't know. I'm very much in the camp that right now is the best time to be a retro gamer with all the stuff happening around us. You know what I mean?
I can't argue with that. So, yeah, let's talk a little more about the Nintendo Switch Online. I would call it a present day incarnation of the Virtual Console, which you alluded to.
Mhm.
Nintendo Switch offers a whole host of continuously expanding retro games emulated from first party and also from third party hardware. They charge a monthly subscription fee, of course, to play them. Nintendo's smart enough as a company to monetize emulation as part of their business model. This allows Nintendo to piggyback off that success that they enjoyed with Virtual Console to the tune of about $50 a year for the expansion pack. That includes the base NES, SNES, Game Boy, plus the N64, Game Boy Advance, and even now Sega Genesis games. I know you're a proponent of NSO as you spoke about. What are your thoughts on the current state of that platform?
I remember when NSO came out and everybody was unhappy with the state of it. And everybody was like, "Oh, this isn't worth the money. This isn't worth the money." But the thing is other consoles do a similar thing. Like PlayStation Plus has the PS3 stuff, and Xbox has their Xbox 360 backwards compatibility, which they did a little bit better in my opinion because they just said, "Hey, you want to play our games? You could download them or use your own disc." I think that's the ultimate way to do it. NSO, in my opinion, I think all things considered, with the way everything's going digital, I think it's the best possible way that Nintendo could have handled the situation. Yes, it would be nice to go to a virtual console and have our Super NES, NES games follow us everywhere we go, but that's not in Nintendo's bag for whatever reason. So I think NSO is the best compromise to this. Now, I'm not really being an apologist and saying that, oh, Nintendo's never wrong. I don't think that NSO is a perfect product in any way, shape, or form. I have a family plan with the expansion pack, and it's been worth it for me because my family loves Animal Crossing. We love Mario Kart. As part of the expansion pack, not only do you get all those old games like Game Boy Advance, Sega Genesis, NES, SNES, you also get access to the DLC of Mario Kart 8, all those new courses. You get access to the Animal Crossing DLC. You get access to the Splatoon, which we don't play, but and if I were to buy all those packs individually for every person in my family, it'd be astronomical. But I just pay $80 a year and don't think twice about it. And if I decide that I don't want it anymore, then I just will stop playing and it's no big deal. I understand that some people want to own that and that's great. They did thankfully put those out on cart, but at the same time, I think NSO is a great product, especially for the fact that not only do they have tons of consoles, and I already said this, but I want to reiterate this point. Not only do they have tons of consoles, but they're also putting out more Japanese content. They're not translating it, which kind of sucks, but I'm still able to play other Japanese games that I wouldn't have ever thought twice of being able to play, especially since they're digging into Satellaview. That was the most recent Super Nintendo update. They put out a Satellaview game, which is mind boggling that they even remembered they released that stuff. I'm hoping with the Switch 2 that they're gonna add GameCube to the mix, maybe Wii U. I don't know what the future holds, but I hope that they add more consoles, and I hope NSO is something that they keep doing, just ad infinitum. Now, I do know that I read an article recently where they did have plans to bring Virtual Console to the Switch, but for whatever reason, they decided to opt out of that and do the NSO thing instead. So I don't know. I don't think there's really a right or wrong answer in this case, but I just know that since Virtual Console has been pushed away, I've seen a hell of a lot more retro games coming to not just Switch, games that probably wouldn't have ever hit like Xbox and PlayStation are coming. Like I think you can get the Castlevania games on those consoles now too, and it's crazy, honestly, like how good it is to be a retro gamer right now.
And they've definitely done a good job of keeping us guessing at what's going to come next. And it really does feel like possibilities are limitless at this point, which is
Hmm.
exciting. I consider this business approach that these big game companies are taking to emulation, I consider it a if you can't beat them, join them approach. And it definitely does not begin and end with Nintendo. Let's take a look at how Sony implements emulation into their business model. The premium tier of PlayStation Plus includes online multiplayer as well as emulation of available PS1, 2, 3, 4, and PSP games. Now, if you ever wondered about a price tag on emulation, here's a small insight. A 3-month subscription to the premium tier of PlayStation Plus is $50 with an updated games list coming out each month. That's equivalent to a full 12 months of NSO. Then you have Xbox Game Pass, once known as Xbox Live Gold. That's Microsoft's subscription service, of course, which includes online multiplayer and a lot of re released and sometimes emulated classic games. That service is now $10 a month. So we have to say NSO wins out of the major game companies on price. It's not even close.
PlayStation and Xbox don't have family plans. Xbox was testing one, but they never released it. That's a big deal for me because I have 6 people in my house that play video games and want to play online. NSO is cheap as hell for us to play it. I just wish PlayStation and Xbox or Microsoft would follow suit and put out a family plan and go with it because I'd be subscribed to all three if they all had family plans, honestly. They all have something different to offer. So that's just my 2 cents on that.
You mentioned this, but it's worth noting again that Sega, Atari, Capcom, and even TurboGrafx have all done something similar when it comes to capitalizing on the huge popularity of emulation. Any company that has ever released a mini console, they've also capitalized on the popularity of emulation. So, as we've demonstrated now, big game companies continue to use emulation as a concept to great financial gain. We would be remiss not to mention backwards compatibility in this conversation. Backwards compatibility is a selling point when it comes to new hardware. You don't lose access to your older game catalog that could otherwise be lost to time. It's now a feature that players desire and have come to expect. Backwards compatibility makes upgrading to the latest and the greatest hardware generation more affordable. And in a way, it also lets companies off the hook for not having killer launch titles, buying them time while early adopters explore the back catalog. There's a lot more we haven't talked about today, like source code preservation, which we just briefly mentioned, lost games, cloud gaming, and a host of intellectual property issues. Consider this a tip of the iceberg exploration of emulation as a whole. I want to close today by giving an irony that I find in emulation. It's ostensibly this big bad illegal thing that is illegal so that the game company's profits will be protected. But the fact is, if I hadn't experienced emulated games growing up, I wouldn't have cared enough about gaming to spend my own money on it later in life when I actually got a job and the resources to do so. This has been TGP episode number 3. We hope you enjoyed it. Leave us a like, comment, and subscribe to the Substack. Remember, without your support, we would not be able to get this content out to you. Like the big game companies, we too offer a premium tier. Justin, tell our listeners what a paid subscription gets them.
If you have a paid subscription, you can have access to our Discord. You can get access to our video podcast and other to be announced features that we are cooking up.
And what are the socials where our listeners can keep up with us?
On all the socials, Torchlight Gaming is going to be it. It's going to be on Instagram, Blue Sky, Twitch, Threads, and I just opened a backlog where you can keep track of the games that I'm reviewing and how far I'm in those games. So kind of like you could see where I am before I review it, and you can see the progress that I'm making. So definitely check that out and join me and be a friend of the community, and let's build something here.
All right, guys and gals, that'll do it for today. Don't miss our next podcast where we'll dive into early internet nostalgia. Thanks again. Later.
Thanks. See ya.